Thank you so much, Chrissy. We appreciate that. Well, once again, I greet you in that wonderful name of Jesus. It's exciting to be with you and to watch what God has done with you throughout these years that you've been together. I'm always amazed when I see people who are able to handle things. This is a basketball. Now, when I hold it in my hands, it's worth about $14.95. But if we would give this to Michael Jordan, it'd be worth $33 million. That makes you think, doesn't it? This is a baseball. Couldn't even find one around the house. I had to borrow this. Now, at Walmart, they run around $8.95. But you know, if you give this to Mark McGuire, it's worth about $19 million. This is a tennis racket. And when I was in college and seminary, I used to know how to handle one. But now in my hand, it's absolutely useless. It won't even kill flies. But you know, you give it to John McEnroe, and it's priceless. It's amazing what difference it makes depending on whose hand it's in. This is a staff. It's one I picked up in Africa a long time ago. In my hand, when I go walking in the evening, maybe I could fend off a dog. But in Moses' hand, it parted the Red Sea. Makes you think. Makes you wonder. What's in your hand? There was a little boy. He followed the crowd. It was a beautiful spring day, and the grass was green. The crowd was large. Each of the gospel writers tells us that there were 5,000 men, plus women and children. That's a big group, somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people. That little boy was a poor boy. His mama had given him a few tiny little circles of barley bread, cheap bread, 5 of them. And 2 tiny little dried out fish that had been salted down and hung in the sun. I could have fit both of them in the palm of my hand. In his hands, it was lunch. But in Jesus' hands, it was a meal that filled the stomachs of thousands of hungry people. You see, it really matters in whose hands it is. I'm excited about you, Myrtle Springs. The last 2 weeks, you've heard some testimonies about this building and the vision you had for it. It took a lot of vision. It's not easy to step out on faith and follow a dream. respond to a need, answer a call. You know, when you put this building together, you signed a note for $1.6 million. That's a lot of money. But it was a 20-year note. But that was only a few years ago. And today, that note has been reduced to where it stands at $230,000 approximately. That's about it. That's a lot of money. But that's nothing like the $1.6 million you started with. That's the really exciting news to me. See what God has done among you. Now you're looking for a new pastor. And God has one for you. And He's going to lead you into new places of service, reaching out to new and really needy people around us. And you have a beautiful facility and a wonderful place by which you can minister to this community, by which you can proclaim Jesus' name. And it'd be awesome if we could welcome the new pastor and have this building just about paid off. This month, we're going to ask you to pray earnestly about it. In fact, this week you'll get a letter from me with some details about what's going on. And inside that letter, besides all the verbiage, there are two things. One is a commitment card. And I want you to keep it on your kitchen table for a while and pray about it. And ask you 4 simple questions about your commitment to the Lord and your prayer and your witness and your willingness to respond to whatever He lays on your heart. I want you to hold on to that card, and at the end of the month, on the 24th, I want you to bring it back. And it'll be something between you and the Lord. There's no place for you to sign it. It's something between you and Him. But as an act of your commitment, on that Sunday I'm going to ask you to come forward and put these cards, whatever you've checked or haven't checked is up to you, but to drop them in the chest that'll be on the table. The second thing in that letter is an envelope. I want you to keep that on your kitchen table too, and I want you to pray about it. For the Lord will lead some of you to make a commitment. To make a commitment that Sunday. To bring an offering to help pay down that loan. Your ministry team has been praying earnestly as we've been preparing for this month. And we'd like to see a real big pay down at the end of the month. And then we've prayed and asked God to give us direction, and we're asking that each of us make that sacrifice so that next year at this time, instead of having a chest of Joash sitting there to receive your gifts, we can have a note-burning service and celebrate God's grace and God's abundance. Now, all of that is the good news. The bad news is that the money to pay off that loan is in your pocket. And that's where it hurts. And that's where we need to become a people of faith and pray for one another and pray for ourselves in terms of the commitment that God would place upon our hearts and the challenge he would give to us. We want to ask him for a miracle, just like he has performed so many times. This morning, I want us to look at the story I mentioned a moment ago about that little boy and his lunch. And I want us to think about the theme of let Jesus have your lunch. Let Jesus have your lunch. The story is found in all four Gospels, but each of the Gospel writers emphasizes something a little bit different. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all talk about the feeding of the 5,000. They all talk about the miracle that Jesus performed. But in John's Gospel, the emphasis upon the disciples and that little boy, the questions that the disciples had in their hearts, their wrestling with logic and understanding, their doubts and their practicality. They're a lot like you and me. They hear the preacher. They say, yeah, that sounds good, but how in the world are we going to do this? So I want us to look at the way John tells the story. He was one of those disciples. He had a lot of questions too. But he discovered something that day that each one of us need to learn. And that is when we put anything in the right hands, the hands of Jesus, it's absolutely amazing what can happen. So let's look together at John chapter 6, the first 14 verses. And I want you to stand with me. John chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. And listen as John tells this exciting story. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great multitude followed him because they saw his miracles which he did on them that were diseased. And Jesus went up into a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was at hand. And when Jesus then lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come up unto him, he said unto Philip, whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? And this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take just a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said unto him, there's a lad here which hath 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes. But what are these among so many? And Jesus said, make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to his disciples, and the disciples to them that were set down, and likewise of the fishes as many as they would. And when they were filled, he said unto his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Therefore they gathered them together and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which remained over and above unto them that had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the miracles that Jesus did, said, this is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world. And all God's people said, amen. Thank you, and be seated. I love reading this story. And apparently the early church loved it too, because it's the only miracle of Jesus that occurs in all four of the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each one remembers so vividly this particular miracle. Each one of them was there. Each one of them saw it from their own perspective, and they shared what they saw. You notice how John keeps on talking about the disciples. There was the multitude, but the disciples came to him. The disciples asked. The disciples did this. He even mentions a couple of them by name, how Philip questioned and reasoned with his logic. How Andrew had scouted out the crowd and found that boy about to eat his lunch. There are a number of exciting things in this story. Each one of them is a challenge. And the first one I want you to see is the challenge of the crowd. The challenge of the crowd. The first thing that absolutely overwhelms us is the largeness of the crowd. There's a big crowd. That's a lot of people. When our family gets together, our 4 kids and their spouses and our 9 grandkids, and my wife goes shopping and I look at the Walmart bill, I say, oh my goodness. Look what this costs every time they all come home. I cannot conceive of trying to feed 5,000 men plus women and children. It's just mind-boggling to me. Each one of the gospel writers is overwhelmed with the size of what Jesus is able to handle. There doesn't seem to be anything that is too big for him, that's impossible for him, that somehow is going to catch him unawares. The disciples were practical men. They weren't just dreamers. They were like you and me. They had to work for a living. They rattled things around in their mind and began calculating on their fingers and toes what's involved in this kind of thing. They were logical. And the logic of the disciples is expressed by Philip. 200 pennyworth isn't enough. Now, that word penny is denarius, and it means a silver coin, which was a day's wages. Philip's just running through his mind. He says, 9.5 months' worth of work wouldn't buy even an appetizer for everybody. What are you talking about, Lord? We don't have that much in the bag. We haven't collected that much. We're just a poor band of disciples. Where are we going to be able to feed them? But there was Jesus. And Jesus thinks differently than we do. In fact, when he looks at logistics, he just comes up with different ideas. You see, Philip was all concerned with how are we going to feed them? Instead, Jesus said, where? Where are we going to do this? There was no question in his mind about how. He was going to ask his Father. He had learned the power of prayer. He knew that when he picked up that bread and raised it to heaven and talked to his Father and asked him to bless it, there was no question about what was going to happen. The only thing for the moment is when it was going to do. So Jesus asked the question, when? Where? But the disciples, just like you and me, are all concerned with how. How are we going to pay off this building? It's not a bad question. But when we take what God has given us and we lift it to the Father in belief, in trust, in surrender, in obedience, then something wonderful begins to happen. He isn't asking you or me to pay off this building. He's asking us to surrender. That's all. Just surrender to Him. Make the commitment to Him, to hear His voice, and what He places on your heart to do. That's it. Paul was a devout Pharisee. In his early life, he hated the church and the message of Christ. He had wreaked havoc in the city of Jerusalem, gathering and collecting the Christians, bringing them to trial and seeing many of them executed. He had subpoenas from the high court, the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, and he was on his way to Damascus in Syria. And there he was going to do the same thing, arrest the leaders of the Christian church, bring them to justice for heresy and blasphemy. And then on the road to Damascus, he met Jesus. His life would never be the same again. But the very first thing he learned about meeting Jesus is the hardest thing to learn. And it's what you and I need to learn. When he met Jesus, the light was so bright, he couldn't discern a figure. It just blinded him, and he fell on his face on the road. And he heard the voice speak to him, "Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me?" And in Acts 9, verse 6, the first words out of Paul's mouth tell it all. There, blinded, laying on the road, he says, "Lord, what would you have me do?" You see, those are the words of surrender. They are the words of commitment. They are the words that make a difference. Paul didn't argue with him, reason with him, or begin to ask him, "How are you going to use me? I've been such an enemy for so many years. I've done horrible things against you and against the church. I'm responsible for the death of many people. There are lots of widows back there in Jerusalem who hate my guts." No, his response to Jesus was simply, "Lord, what would you have me do?" And that must be our response in every situation. It's not our place to argue with God. We surrender. We become obedient. We listen to His voice and we follow where He leads. And the only response that's of value from our mouth is, "Lord, what would you have me to do?" And that's the question that I want you to ask yourself over and over again. It's not about equal gifts. We're not going to take that $230,000 and divide it up among the heads that we have out here. It's about sharing the sacrifice, sharing the responsibility, about each one of us responding as God lays on our hearts and lives. Every time we come to crossroads like this, we're facing big decisions about ministry. Do we stagnate or do we cultivate? That's the questions that we have to ask. Do we plateau or do we go out and plow? That's what we're dealing with. This is a community ripe, ready. And you've been given a unique position, an awesome responsibility, and a wonderful team of leaders who have caught a vision of what it means to reach out in Jesus' name and to make a difference right here where we live. Let's set ourselves free from this debt so we can move forward without restrictions to the harvest that's waiting for us. There was not just the challenge of the crowd that Jesus presented to the disciples. There was also a challenge for the disciples themselves. It was a new way of thinking, a new way of reasoning. When we read this story in the other Gospels, particularly in Matthew and Mark, it's interesting what the disciples say, because in Matthew and Mark, they say, let's just ignore the crowd. Send them away. It's getting late. They need to go buy something for supper. It's easy for us to do that too. It's easy for us to ignore the opportunities that are around us. The only trouble is, there are a lot of senior adults here in Hooks that need to be brought in to fellowship, to service. Some to break up the loneliness they feel and discover the love of the family of faith. There are many young families right here in Hooks, and they need to blend with our families and feel the encouragement and support of the family of faith and in raising their children in a godly way. And you can provide the basis for that. And youth and children, you see them running out of here every morning as we come to the offering time. The excitement on their faces, the bounce in their step, the smile on their faces. They need that training, but they're not alone. There are a host of children growing up as your neighbors all around this community. And their teenagers and their children don't know Jesus. They don't have a spring in their step. They don't have a smile that gleams from their eyes and faces. They're becoming hardened by our world. They're becoming indoctrinated by the lack of standards, morals, values, and ethics. You can make a difference in their lives by investing in the children and the youth in this community. And now you've been blessed with facilities to do just that. From our youth building to our children's building to our gym to our nurseries. God has given us that means to deal with the crowd. We have no right to ignore it. That's the field He sent us to. Some of us are just like Philip. we look at the impossibility of a task, particularly because we add and subtract and multiply and divide and say, we can't afford it. We can't do this. It's not financially feasible. Well, you've already seen how he answered that prayer. As Lila mentioned this morning, the payment of this building doesn't come out of our budget. Our budget goes to running the ministries and the maintenance and support of the ministries of this church. But the payment of this loan, this is over and above. This is from the hearts of people who have caught the vision and made the commitment month by month. And not only give their tithes and the offerings to missions and so forth, but also see that this debt will be met each month, and then some. And we have moved so far ahead of that 20 years. Month by month, we knock thousands of dollars off of that loan because some have caught the vision and placed the resources in Jesus' hands. But all of us need to catch a vision of what we can do. All of us need to put the calculators away and just put the resources in Jesus' hands. The disciples said, the resources are inadequate. In Matthew's gospel, when he tells this story, Philip says, there's not enough bread in town to feed these people. I don't even know where we'd go to buy it. That's what happens when we begin looking at things. But Jesus looks at people. And over again, his ministry is not things. It's people. It's 5,000 men and their women and children today. It's 4,000 another day. It's this poor woman caught in adultery on another day. But it is people, and it is always people. And that's what moved his heart, and that's what raised his face to look at God his Father and trust. And to step out and respond. You know, I've read this story over and over again in each of the Gospels, and I'm amazed there wasn't a Baptist among any of these disciples. Not a single one of them said, why don't we take an offering? Well, they hadn't learned that yet, I guess. But that's something we can do. But we can't do that until hearts are prepared. Until each one of us has had the chance to talk to the Lord about, what would you have me do? Till each one of us has dealt with the problem of surrender to Him. Till each one of us personally understands what obedience means as a believer. Finally, there's one more thing, and that's that little boy, the challenge of the child. You know, we often forget about him. I don't know where he came from. I don't know whether he overheard the conversation of Jesus and the disciples and offered his lunch, or whether Andrew, who had been out scouting the field and saw him ahead of time and nabbed it. But I know there's some amazing things about that little boy. The first was to grab his lunch. In fact, there's several miracles here, and the first miracle is the boy hadn't eaten it already. My father used to take my brother and I fishing a lot when we grew up in Florida. And my dad always believed that you had to be down on the water in the Gulf before the sun came up. My mom always packed us a bunch of lunch and some snacks. My dad used to get quite angry lots of times. It would be 9 o'clock in the morning, and my brother had finished lunch and was working on the snacks, you know. And this is a miracle, that this little boy still had that lunch that his mother had prepared for him. There's another miracle about him. He was a Jewish boy, by the way, and he could have gained more. He could have bargained with Andrew. I'll tell you what, I'll let you have my lunch if. But he didn't do that either. He just gave it all to Jesus. He had an option. He could have given a portion. After all, there were 2 fish. There were 5 little loaves of bread. He could have said, wait a minute, let me make my sandwich and you can have the rest. But he didn't do that. In simple, childlike trust, he just placed it all in Jesus' hands. And he let him use it and distribute it as he saw best. He could have not granted all of it, but instead refused to give and to just walk away and ignore the responsibility. But he didn't. He granted all of it to Jesus, turned it all over to him. I don't know how many of you ever heard of or remember George W. Truett. He was pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas for 50 years before W.A. Criswell became pastor for another 50 years. It was back in the 30s. That's a long time ago. Those were difficult years. Truett was doing a fantastic job at First Baptist of Dallas. He was invited out into West Texas to speak at a little church. He was asked to help them. They needed to make a lot of repairs on their building. And they were going to cost $6,500, which was a lot of money back then. Truett preached the whole week, all about giving, all about commitment. And at the end of the week, that Sunday morning, when the final service came, they raised $3,000. They were $3,500 short. So Truett just looked at the little congregation and he asked them to pray. They spent a few moments in prayer. Then he challenged them once again. And he asked them to pray. And they prayed. And when they finished praying, a couple stood up over there, an elderly couple. And they said, you know, just last week, we were offered $3,500 for our house. And as we've been sitting here praying, the Lord just has brought us under conviction. We're going to sell it. And we're going to give that $3,500. And then all of a sudden something happened. People started standing throughout the congregation and making verbal commitments one after another. For the example that couple had set had moved their hearts too. And it wasn't long before the money was completely raised and that couple never had to give up their home at all. You see, when you become obedient and you place things in Jesus' hands, you never know how he's going to use it or what's going to happen. But there will be a blessing for you and for others. And your commitment to him will change this community and the world.